Great. So we're getting into our second panel discussion today. I'm very excited about this one, actually. So we are going to have Claire Leberes from Airbnb. We have Vic Soggins from Coinbase, Carly Burton from Meta, and then Tope Okeke from YouTube. And the discussion is going to be about standardizing AI access for all, bringing the culture and knowledge gap between design teams and technical ML skills. I look forward to it. Thank you.
Great, thank you for the introduction. Can you all hear me okay? Yep. Great, well, I'm Claire. I worked at Airbnb until September, but I just joined a new rocket ship called Malt, which you may not have heard about, but it's okay, it's not the topic of today. I'm very excited about what we're gonna talk about, like how do we make machine learning teams and design teams work together? How do we bridge the culture gap? And really have a great group to tell us about their own experience and what they've seen work in the space. So Carly, who's a design director for AI Infra at Meta, and has really a kind of a diverse background. You've done a lot of things, ethnography, you've done also product management, you've seen applied AI, really a lot of interesting things that we're going to learn about. Toby, who is a product growth science and analytics lead at EU2, and I've just learned that before we got into the room. She also has her own company and is doing a lot of interesting things on the side. And we have Vic, who's product lead at Coinbase, machine learning lead, really the expert at Coinbase, and fascinating to hear yesterday from you that he's actually working as a consulting with many different teams on machine learning application, recommender system, risk, personalization, all things at Coinbase. Anything you'd like to add, maybe for the audience to get to know you a little bit better? Did I cover it? Great. Awesome. Well, on the topic of machine learning and design teams working together, I thought we maybe could start with our panelists' kind of own journey into the space. Obviously, you know, some people have more or less kind of straight path into machine learning. But how did you guys get into that? Maybe Carly, can you tell us how did you get into machine learning and learned about the field?
Yeah, hi everyone. So my love affair with AI, I think, started when I did an ethnographic study around the world. I got to meet with around 400 digital natives and understand from them what did they expect out of technology. I wasn't expecting at that moment to then go on a 10-year journey of learning everything I could about AI. But through that ethnography, I found that they really had a deep connection and were almost expecting AI to have empathy. And at the time, I was actually building data lakes and looking at these data sets that were very unstructured and inconsistent and incomplete. And I was thinking to myself, like, how are we going to meet these needs? And then I was also looking around the table, and it was mostly data scientists and engineers. And at the time, I was doing product management. I was like, all right, this is a space for design, for research, for product managers. How do we all come together and think about building AI based on what the end user experience would need to be? So in that moment, I sort of took a plan, and it was threefold. One, pick a space where I could go really deep. I know that the field is vast. It wouldn't make sense to try to learn everything. And so for me, that case was time series and going from 0 to 1, building an ensemble model that we ended up patenting. Great learning experience. The second thing was I wasn't going to go back to school. I think that you can learn a lot whenever you get to solve real world problems. So I just surrounded myself with like incredibly bright people that all had a difference of background and perspective from myself. And then the third part was, and this one's a bit personal, was have a lot of self-compassion. I knew that it was going to be very difficult, and I was going to have to get comfortable with being incredibly uncomfortable. I think AI is esoteric. It's, you know, a field where people go to get PhDs like yourself that spend their whole lives working on a very specific problem space. And so I needed to humble myself to this journey. And now, 10 years later, a couple of data products behind me working on some really complex problems at Meta that hopefully can talk about today. That was my journey.
Very inspiring. How about you, Toby?
Hi everyone, I am Toby, and I think my journey started from maybe after I completed my bachelor's, because I have a bachelor's in computer science and a master's in computer and information system. So I pretty much worked in various roles and domains in tech, and I decided to pivot into data science and analytics after my master's program in 2015. So for me, I have always worked in the infrastructure and networking side at the early stage of my career, but over time, I saw the importance of data during my master's program when I was exposed to like the data modeling, the data warehousing, and all of that stuff. So I started my career. I started as a data analyst in an e-commerce industry where I was analyzing descriptive and diagnostic analysis. But over time, I pivoted into like the financial sector, and I also worked in 3 different healthcare sectors before I got the job at Google, where I work on the YouTube team. So over time, throughout my career in all these industries, one thing was unique or common because I was always analyzing marketing and product data. So I have always led like the analytics around like tracking the effectiveness of marketing campaigns. So being able to work with like different industry that spend from like $5,000 in marketing to like millions of dollars in marketing, and being that source of that person that is being relied on to actually provide models and also like predict the effectiveness of marketing campaign. So over time, I started building models, mostly for marketing, which centered around regression models and also classification models, as well as clustering for like marketing segmentation and customer segmentation. So one thing is different at Google. It's like the way Google does AI is completely different from like how they do it everywhere. I have worked, they have like a lot of in-house tool. At Google, they have something called Vertex AI, whereby you can automate like all these models and build those things. So, and by the side, just like she said, I also have, I'm also the founder of Data TechCon, which is more like a data analytics consulting and AI company, where I also promote data literacy, especially among underrepresented community. So that was how I got to AI.
Another very interesting path. All right, Vic, how about you?
Yeah, so I definitely didn't start my career thinking I was going to get involved in this space. So I started my career as a mechanical engineer. So I was designing buildings for new construction, renovations, things like that. And so I wanted to do something a little bit more fast-paced. I joined a startup that was sort of adjacent to where I was working in mechanical engineering and energy. And it was there that I worked a lot with data scientists, and kind of we were doing a lot of time series forecasting, trying to predict how buildings are operating, where might they reduce energy consumption, things like that, with the sort of proliferation of smart meters, which are now pretty ubiquitous, but they didn't always used to be that way. And so that was fun, and really it's something that I wanted to stay in. I thought, even though I wasn't a trained data scientist or AI practitioner, it was something that I thought, I was interested in and I could get better at. And so, I had a short stint at a bank where we were looking at sort of like who might we target for loan offers. I worked at WeWork, where I was working on the growth team there, trying to sort of grow our market share within the enterprise segment. I worked on things like lead scoring. I worked on things like, predicting what spaces people might be interested in based on their needs, things like that. And then I joined Coinbase about 2.5 years ago, and so I am a lead on the product on the machine learning team there, where we build models for very specific use cases related to risk, personalization, search, things like that. And then we also build an in-house ML platform. So it's not just building the models, but how do you actually sort of train them, serve them, make sure that you have data processing, all of that other stuff. And then what I really enjoy about this particular role is that it's not just about building models for like offline analysis. It's more about how do you actually build a production-ready model that can sort of be served in real time at low latencies, and then maybe lead to sort of other sort of cascading business impact, whether that's reducing fraud, increasing revenue, things like that. So it's like very close to the value of where, like basically ultimately where what the company cares about. And I would say one thing that I really enjoyed is that there's so many different places where machine learning applies. So if you're a very curious person like myself, there's a lot of industries that you might be interested in. People ask, oh, where would you want to work? I don't really even always have a great answer to that question, but I feel good knowing that my skill sets in data can sort of translate across different industries, and so that's good. But yeah, I never thought I would be working in this.
It sounds like data was a thread for a lot of us. Like, obviously, like AI and ML is nothing without the data, but you know.
Definitely, very, very interesting. So you can see all like different paths and learning along the way, right? Which I think is going to be a theme for us. Do any of you have maybe a horror story to share when you're thinking about, you know, the gap between designers and machine learning teams on the other side? Have you seen, you know, do you have examples of things going wrong or anti-patterns you've noticed? Any horror stories that come to mind?
I can share. Yeah, so I can share like a scenario or like a story, being that I would say my role sit at the intersection of data science, product management, as well as growth marketing, right? And over the years, I used to be a web dev, so I was building like product myself. So I've always noticed like there is this gap or the bridge between like the designers as well as the engineers. So in this context, the engineers would be like the machine learning engineers. So it's always, I think one thing that strikes across all the industries that I have worked on is always, I would say, communication issue. Like the engineers don't understand how to translate those engineering specification into like business layout, and the business stakeholders don't know how to like translate those. So in this context, like the designers, they understand like everything they want to like design, or like the mock-up or the prototype and all, but it's always like hard in terms of codifying them. So we're not saying the designers need to understand how to write code, but it's more like understanding the basics will always help like getting them far in terms of understanding what the end product will look like from the engineering standpoint.
I might want to talk about like a framework of what creates horror stories, if that's like helpful, because
Go for it.
I think there's like a lot of examples of when models go wrong, right? When you expect them to perform a certain way and they don't. Maybe it was overfit, maybe it wasn't trained on the right data, but the people involved in crafting that, and you know, traditionally in product, we all know you look at the intersection of like what's desirable, what's feasible, what's viable, and that's where you get your requirements. And then when you introduce a model into that product, things can kind of go anywhere, right? You're introducing kind of a new agent of change. And so I think that one of the frameworks that I'd like, you know, maybe people to think about is wrapping responsibility as another concentric circle into that. And for product teams together to say like, well, like, is this even something that we should be introducing? Like, what's the application here? What problem are we solving? Do we have actually the adequate data in order to train the model to get it to be at the performance that we need it to be? Is the output of that, when someone makes a decision off of it, is it going to inform them to take a better action? Is it a multiplier? Are we removing human agency? I think that without that responsibility circle, we can end up into these horror stories of, you know, like, oh, well, the business problem is this, and, you know, yes, we see a market need for it, and like we can do it, we can feasibly do it. But if you don't bring together all of these different disciplines, and I think maybe this is your question on like, you know, where design goes wrong, is that designers, I think, naturally will think about that experience and, you know, through that training, the connection across those different dimensions. And then PMs often are thinking about, you know, like, all right, yeah, what is the business context? What is the data telling me? And then engineer wants to, you know, build something. And so you really need to pull all of these disciplines together and anchor them on that problem, and then have this kind of framework so that you avoid the horror stories. But, you know, I know people end in horror stories that they don't mean to get there because of just these unintended consequences of like incomplete data sets, or like, we didn't go through, we set the wrong reward function, and the person who set the reward function didn't realize what the implication was going to be, and so on. So I think, you know, more generally looking at it.
That's a very interesting framework. Maybe a question back to you, and then we can see what you're thinking about that, Vic. Which is, today at Meta, do you implement that framework? Like, who in the organization is implementing that? Is it the product manager, design? Like, how do you ensure that that cross-functional group is working in the way you described?
Yeah, so we do. And it was something that whenever I joined, collaboration is like one of the key values actually that I have for my team, along with adaptability and curiosity. I feel like if you don't have those traits, it's really hard for teams to look at problems, flip them around. I also felt that, we have a lot of tensions that we have to trade off. We're not just serving one customer. We're obviously an internal team, but, we have customers that are building content understanding models. They're building ranking and recommendation, natural language processing, no language left behind. All of these different use cases have different needs. They require different tools. And how do you take all of these different desires and then viability? I'm sure you guys watch our earning reports. There are some specific things that we need to do that are very clear. And then feasibility. The field is changing all the time. Like, do you use a declarative or an imperative framework, whatever you're using pipelines? All of these trade-offs. And then the responsibility factor, right? Like, we don't want to be reactive to regulations, right? Like, we have to reduce the anarchy in development. We have to look at privacy and governance, and that has to be integrated. It cannot be an afterthought where you're just like, oh yeah, I'm gonna do my data and feature prep and authoring, and I'm gonna deploy this model, and everything's great. These things have to come together. And so I think in any type of development process, whether you're building to produce these models or you're taking an applied AI and bringing into a product, I think stretching the practice to include responsibility is table stakes at this point. I think the industry's matured enough to change that three Venn diagram into 4.
As a product lead, does that resonate with you?
Yeah, it definitely does. I think on that last point, part of being, a good product manager is trying to anticipate what sort of obstacles might be out there. And so certainly on the responsibility side, that people are going to ask you, how does a model work? What happens in this case? Just general things like that. And you need to just be able to answer it in not just a quantitative, ML-friendly way, but in a way that's going to be sort of resonates with your audience. And also another thing I've come to find out is that there's not really a lot of hard and fast rules that maybe legal and regulatory teams, compliance teams, and the like will say, it's written, this is what you have to do. It's more about trying to negotiate, trying to explain why something sort of should be permissible, and then working pragmatically with them. But certainly, along the theme of responsibility and things like that, there's just kind of like, you have to be kind of empathetic to what sort of arguments you might hear or perspectives that exist, and try to just work with people on that.
Great, thank you. So whose responsibility is it? Is it
everyone's?
Hi.
It's interesting because I know with this talk, it's about these different disciplines, but I really think you got to put the disciplines almost aside and what's the problem, and how do we come together and bring our strengths to solve that problem in the best way. And design has just changed so much over the last 15, 20 years. It's like...
How so?
I think if you were to ask every person in this room, tell me what a designer is and what do they do? One person might describe an industrial designer. Another person might define a graphic designer.
Right.
And you have service designers, you have product designers, and you have all these things that actually might be interesting to talk about, sort of with the evolution of design as a practice, how that has started to converge and ask for new collaboration models with product managers, with data scientists, with engineers, and how hybrid the talent is coming out of the market. I have a designer who's also a comp sci major, and she programs her own stuff. So it's very evolutional right now.
Great. Well, you talk about market. I have a question for you on hiring, right? When you're shaping these teams with different functions, whether you're hiring for designers, for machine learning engineer, data scientists, how has that changed over the years? As you're building more and more, ML products and working on ML products, do you think about how that collaboration factor when you're hiring people? That's something you look for. How do you approach hiring in the context of having all of these functions work together?
I think for me, having been in the position whereby I have hired like designers as well as data scientists, I think it has changed over time. Especially in the tech industry, it's kind of like at this point, even if you're just like a graphic designer or just like designing marketing creatives and all, they just expect you to be kind of like data driven. Right? Because they believe everything starts and ends with data, especially when the industry is more on the digital product side of things, right? So starting from like the UX designers, the web designers, the graphic designers and all, I think at this point, everyone, one way or the other, they're trying to like learn about data and also learn about, even if it's just the basics, like not necessarily like coding or building the model themselves, but I think they've really seen like this will actually help them stand out and gain competitive edge over other applicants.
I think that sort of data fluency piece, though, is not lost on design. Like the actual core way of coming at a problem is often bottoms up, where you want to go and you pull thick data, right? It's qualitative in nature. And it's smaller, right? Like, whereas data scientists are working with big data. We both have a deep appreciation for finding sense in it, right? And in that sense-making process, and where are those patterns? So I think that there's that commonality. I also think for designers and engineers, they're highly iterative in their process. It's not about landing on the right thing right away. You have a hypothesis, right, and then you want to build through it. Mm-hmm. One of the things when I've approached hiring is very much around these kind of active characteristics that I hope a candidate has, which is more around, I mentioned curiosity as a value. That's critical, right? Because it's like, how are they going to approach the problem and how are they going to continue to grow? A second thing is grit. Like, I want to see stories of how they were in a really deep problem and they were able to get out of it. Because there needs to be resilience in this space as you work through it. And I think the third one is maybe a little softer, and that's humility, because we don't all have the answers. Right. Every day is something to learn about, and you have to, I think, humble yourself to sort of that, and that we can be a part of it, right? Like, we came out of an AI winter, look, there's a lot of momentum, there's interesting things happening in open AI, and just how do you, when you look at your candidates, it's not about just assessing their product thinking or their linear regression skills or like what model or paper that they wrote. It's sometimes about these characteristics beyond the craft. And that's how you can create these super teams that run really fast and that they're collaborative versus competitive with one another.
Yeah, big plus one on curiosity and sort of grit, resilience. I would say another thing that I look at in particular with ML engineers is the ability to sort of understand how a model will ultimately be used and work within a production system. What I've often seen is that it's one thing to build a model that's, again, offline, used maybe for research purposes, and it has kind of one finding, but being able to kind of think about, if you go through a certain flow or, products is meant to use the decision from a model in some way, how do you actually integrate it within, the whole holistic experience? And that will often translate into system design to an extent. And so you kind of have to have some ability to understand like the ramifications and implications for model design decisions on the broader system design, and then try to get out ahead of that, anticipate it, think through it, and things like that. So that's one challenge I've seen that even strong machine learning engineers on paper have when they're actually in the thick of things. Yeah. So
once we've hired these great people, do you have any recommendation, or have you seen ways to organize teams and these people work together that works more or less well for them to collaborate? I'm particularly thinking about your current role actually at Coinbase, where you are your machine learning product lead and you have your own team, but you also you are consulting with different product teams across the company, and so your role by definition is a bridge, right, with people who may be less knowledgeable on machine learning. Do you have any perspective on, what type of roles do you need for really kind of the sauce to work well, or ways to organize the teams that you would recommend for people?
Yeah, so I would say communication is obviously very important, but when you're collaborating with other teams and you're sort of like representing your team, the PM can't be in every single room and be the only person who sort of solicits requests or questions around how to use ML. Sometimes it is an engineer who's taking a question from somebody else. And so I would just say like the ability to sort of empathize, be kind of impact driven, think about what, ultimately what impact you're having as opposed to necessarily the idea, the ML idea is very important. The other thing I would say is that there are unicorns, people who can do everything seemingly, but that's not practical. And so you kind of have to acknowledge sort of the strengths and weaknesses that some people have. Like there's people that I know who are great at 0 to 1 applications. They know really that the first instance of a system that leverages ML may have very little ML. It may be heuristics driven, but they know how to kind of build the foundation and the pipes to be able to support a more advanced ML use case later down the road. And so they can kind of see that 0 to 1 to beyond, and that's a great person to have when you are starting from scratch and you're saying, well, I mean, here's kind of like where I want to go, but I don't necessarily know how to get there exactly. And there's other people who are like really like deep ML practitioners. They really may not even care that much about the system, but they're actually really want to try this new technique that they read about, right? And so these skill sets that people have, can be they can be relevant in different ways, and so part of it is just like understanding that and trying to like work with it and find opportunities for everybody.
I sort of feel like your question depends though on like, are you working on applied AI, or are you actually like in the kitchen building tools or the infrastructure to like craft these models? And so the answer would be dependent on that. But in absence of that, since everyone's coming from a different place, I try to break up the problem in like 3 ways. I look at the people, and so that's around like, what's the skills that I've got, what levels, what chemistry exists. I look at the problem, and then I look at the domain. And I try to marry teams based on those different elements. And in some cases, like, I'm glad this isn't being recorded, you don't actually have the pod model because you don't need it, And that's, I think, also about today. We have to do a lot more with less. Because, you said there's these unicorns. I mean, like, talent is not everywhere, right? And you have to grow people, and you have to sort of like give people that opportunity, to reach in and, do product requirements definition or do some coding or whatever that may be. So I think that it's about, what's the case, and then breaking it up that way. That's how I've thought about it, at least.
For me, I think +1 to what Vic and what she said, as Callie said as well. Just to add to her point, I think some of the roles are more like IC roles, whereby you're like individual contributors, and at that point you might be like the only person like maybe overseeing the project from start to finish. And I would say like my role is an IC role, though I have like TBCs that do like the data pipeline stuff and all, but in terms of like building the model itself, it's more like, hey, you talk about the business problem and all of that stuff. So I think one thing that has actually worked so well for us is, like you said, we all need to learn from each other, and we're all responsible at that point. So it's something called project documentation. there's no project that has to be executed by like the machine learning engineers or like the project management or like any analytics team at Google that doesn't require project documentation. And I think that's a very great way for everybody to learn about what is going on. It always starts with the background, the problem, the methodology, as well as the breakdown of the work stream. And I think so far, even when I joined, it was kind of like a struggle hearing like different terms, but it's like you have something to refer back to and learn from it and understand where at every stage of the project. So I think that is also a great way to actually force that out.
Very, very interesting. I like the question of organization. I'm just going to share one thing before I ask you my next question, and then hopefully we can open up for your guys' questions. For me, the moment that shifted my career and in relationship to design was the day I reported to the chief design officer at Airbnb, right? So I was the head of data for the team, reporting to the chief design officer, and I was like, wow, that opened my mind. This is what you're thinking about. These are the questions you're asking yourself, right? This is how you approach the business, and that really made a huge difference for my entire team also to get that empathy, right? That kind of opening the box of this is how you kind of you think about problems. And so I love when you say marrying people, getting the perspective, definitely made a difference. All right. You all had your own journey, learning experience through machine learning, and we hire people, we make them work together. But as leaders and people leader, how do you think about your people journey into machine learning? Their kind of learning. How do you upskill people into the domain? Are there things you've seen work well, not well? You are teaching a class, I know, on design and AI. Yeah. So I'm very interested to hear more about that. I also know you mentioned, right, that you're teaching. You are teaching daily in your work in some ways, right? So what do you see? What do you teach people? And do you have any recommendation for people, classes that maybe add their resources, saying that you found really helpful to bring people to the next level of ML?
I'll jump in. So there's a couple approaches that I take. One is obviously reverse mentoring, because I think that everybody has something to offer, and it's about looking at your talent pool and finding out what that is, and then making the right connections. And then the second part is always having a learning program. That's always my expectation with the teams that I manage. And that learning program I like when it's developed from the internal group, that you're not just bringing people from the outside and dropping them in. Because I think often whenever you empower the person to share, it helps them also internalize a bit more about what it is that they know and what they're doing. It builds better culture, it builds connections, and so, it's complementary. And I think the third part is helping people break it down. If you were just to say, like, I want you to be an expert in AI and ML, it's like, that's really scary. And I think it's almost sort of like, pick an area and just go really deep and try to do it yourself. The best way to learn is through doing. You're also talking to somebody who, like, I went, to Columbia here in New York. That's what brought me here. And I was like, I'm going to go back to school one day. And I was like, once I started this kind of like, there are so many learning resources out there at your fingertips. I was like, I'm never going back to school. I learn through experience. And so I encourage others to do that, but I give them structure. I don't just say, figure it out. I find out what's your passion. And so I have one designer who really wants to be the data SME. And so I said, all right, let's look at data and feature prep just as the process in development. Let's look at these tools. Let's look at just these model types. Let's talk about data labeling. And we break it down, and then that gives them confidence, and then they start to show up with, ability to kind of show value. And then, so I don't have any designers or researchers on my team saying, hey, I want a seat at the table, I want a seat at the table. Every single one of them earned a seat, and they have the respect, and they're working on the strategy. And so it's really great. So I guess I'm a much more find it organically than go get it programmatically, but make your organic process programmatic, if that makes sense.
All right, for me, plus one to the structured programming. It's very important when we start learning. It's like a lot of people, I mean, we hear the buzzwords since the pandemic. I know like the rate at which people are pivoting into the data science, machine learning, and AI has really skyrocketed. However, some people are still lost in the journey because they're just like literally like hopping from one free training to the next free training and all of that stuff. And at the end of the day, they never complete the program because definitely they don't have any roadmap or any like career trajectory on how they want to like evolve over time. For me, what I always say is AI is broad. Decide on which aspect or which subcategory you want to focus on, being machine learning, computer vision, robotic, deep learning, and all. Then you can decide on the specific domain as well. Like in my case, I've always specialized in like marketing and product domain. So there's some type of model that data scientists build, and there's some type of model that data science that focus in marketing builds, things like MMM, marketing mix model, things like causal impact, causal inference, and all of that stuff. So if you pick a domain specifically, you're gonna learn better and become an expert in that domain rather than just being a generalist. It's like at the end of the day, you can be a data scientist, and when I say MML, you might not even know what I'm talking about because that's peculiar to like the marketing team, being able to like measure the effectiveness of marketing campaigns and also like drive ROI and all of that. And I've always had the mission to promote data literacy, and I would say I am super excited and proud because I started my company in 2020 and I have helped more than 200 people of color break into the data science and analytics field successfully, all of them with zero technical background, zero tech experience. So I would say I have a strength in actually like breaking things down for like non-technical people.
Yeah, I like the make organic programmatic type of an approach, because I think, you know, when you don't really have a playbook for something, you're just sort of applying different patterns and trying to just do the best you can, but then you'll over time see what works, what doesn't, and then you'll sort of try and create a process around it. So I think we do the same thing. You know, I am not as hands-on with the ML engineer as the engineering manager is, so they have far more intimate understanding of like how to really up-level people. But from what I've seen is like, you've got some people that are early in their career. They're out of school, they're very bright. I think for these types of folks, trying to figure out, like, put them in an area where they're in a position to succeed. But then I think giving ownership of some piece, it can be very small, but just giving them that sense of ownership gives them the motivation, gives them sort of that, that recognition over time to kind of keep going. And then you've got other people that are a little bit more senior. Maybe they've been focusing on a very specific area. Maybe they want to do something different. And so when that's the case, that is a little bit more challenging because they are so deep in maybe an area, and maybe they don't like it wherever you're sort of putting them, or you just kind of have to like figure out where they can thrive outside of their area. And maybe if they want to go back to what they were doing before, that's okay too. So, you know, I don't really have a great answer for that, but I would just say trying to just do the best you can. You know, I wish I could say more there. I would say though, as a product manager, I am like always coming back to being able to kind of like understand how a model like fits in with the business that you are in, right? And being able to kind of like have an open mind around where might we have opportunities to apply ML. And so once you can kind of like just do that, think outside the box, and be a little bit, you know, creative even. I'm always encouraging engineers to do that, because as a product manager, again, like I'm talking about the problems, I'm talking about, you know, the people that we have and sort of what the strategy of the company is, and then I'm always relying on others to sort of like help, you know, get ideas and do things like that. So.
I'm sorry, I just got the sign that we are out of time, but we're going to be outside for a few minutes if you have questions for the panelists. Yeah, please stay. Thank you so much for your perspective.